Good evening. How wonderful to see all of you here tonight. My name is Liz Smith. I'm a founding board member of the National Cold War Center. Could not be more happy to be here tonight on our annual Cold War weekend. I want to be sure that we thank all the people who've made the evenings possible today. Pattern Energy is our sponsor this evening, and we appreciate their help. I hope they're here somewhere. I can see no one except the light. And we're also appreciative of the Blytheville, City of Blytheville, City Advertising Tourism Promotion Commission for also helping us fund this evening tonight. It's a great time to be here, a great weekend to be in Blytheville. We have all kinds of things planned for you. And tonight, I think you'll find it to be a real treat. Each year, we try to bring to you someone who's specifically interesting on the subject of the Cold War. And we've had some outstanding speakers, outstanding interviewees. I don't think we've had a disappointing evening so far. And I think tonight will also be very fulfilling for you. It's my pleasure to introduce the man who sat and watched history happen, very important history with regard to the Cold War, Pavel Palazhchenko, who was Gorbachev's chief interpreter and later became an advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev. And Pavel has had I said to him, do you realize you've had a positively amazing life? And he says, yeah, well, you live your life. But he has done some things none of us have done, for sure. So I hope you'll give a warm welcome to Pavel Palazhchenko. Right. And I just remembered I didn't bring my cell phone, so I have no idea how much time I'm using. So here we go. So good evening, Pavel. Here we are again, right?
Good evening.
I know. Good to be here. So there is so much to talk to you about. We could cover so much history, but let's start, before we start on the real historic aspects of your work, I'd like to know a little bit about the profession of being an interpreter. I think that it's fair to say many of us in the audience probably have not spent a lot of time in our professions working with interpreters. And it's, as I've read about you, I find it must have been a literally fascinating field to be in. So tell us, I know in your book, you do say that you loved the language. You loved linguistics. How did you really get started in interpretation? What really propelled you into that particular field?
Yeah, I think I wanted to be translator, interpreter, I wanted to know languages, and made my decision to take this path in life when I was 13 or 14. Before that, I had some different ideas. My mother was a teacher of English. She taught me some English. She also had, she did some work as a language tutor to other kids, and sometimes we had classes together with her. But until about 13 or 14 years old, I was not that interested in languages. I don't know why. But then it suddenly started, and maybe, music, the Beatles, that was that period. Maybe that played a role.
Well, certain
And
things
maybe
go
something
way
else
back
played a role.
first.
Anyway, I
So
decided.
the
The
Beatles.
Beatles, yes. So,
That's the Beatles. Well, that's interesting.
and I decided that I will be a student at what is now called Moscow Linguistic University. At that time, it was called Moscow Institute of Foreign Languages. Those were really the best years of that particular college. Our teachers were, I really believe, were the best. Still grateful to them all. And the exams were not that difficult. I was surprised. And, 5 years at that school, and then a year at the United Nations language training course where they actually trained interpreters and translators for the United Nations. I was lucky to be accepted. In '74, I came to this country for the first time. I was 25 years old, worked for 5 years as interpreter at the United Nations. Wonderful years. I was young. Those were perhaps not the best years for the city of New York, but I liked everything.
What year, that was when, the 70, did you say in the 70s?
74 to 79, yes. Then the financial crisis, all kinds of problems, etc. But for me, those were years that actually shaped me as a professional interpreter.
What was it really like being a young Russian coming to New York City in the late 70s?
Yeah,
Must
well,
have been
in
fairly stunning.
mid 70s, in 1974,
Yeah.
what was it like? Well, certainly we saw and understood the differences in the standard of living and way of life. By that time, the Soviet Union was in a period that historians and we call stagnation. The country was not moving forward economically, politically. There was nothing for a young person to be interested in. No free elections, no free press. I was not, I must say, even at that time, I was not a big fan of the system. But certainly I was a loyal citizen of the country. I was a patriot of my country. But for me, the important thing was advancing in my profession.
Yeah.
That really was something that I believed in. And New York was the period that shaped me as a professional interpreter. Then I was lucky because when I returned to Moscow, at that time the translation department of the Soviet Foreign Ministry was expanding for all kinds of reasons. Among those reasons was that we were at that time engaged in arms control negotiations with the United States. And so they hired me, and my first assignment was at the negotiations on force reductions in Europe. Those were negotiations that had dragged on for years without any success. So in a way, when I was sent to be an interpreter at those negotiations, in a way it was depressing because one expects as a diplomat, as an interpreter, that you're not working just, to show your professionalism. You're working to achieve something, and those negotiations were really going nowhere. Then, in 1982, the negotiations on arms control, on arms reduction, negotiations on intermediate range nuclear missiles began. Those two were difficult and ultimately unsuccessful negotiations. But I think I learned a great deal during those negotiations. The heads of delegations, the Soviet and the US delegation, were people of really very high diplomatic caliber. One of them, Paul Nitze, was a lot older than his Soviet counterpart, Yuri Krasinski. But the dynamic, the interaction between them was quite interesting, quite good. So I learned a lot in those negotiations, even though the negotiating positions of the Soviet side and the US side were kind of set in stone, and these negotiations too were not going well.
Well, let's go back. Let's go back and talk about interpreting, though. So you got into this. You loved language. You went to school. Obviously, moved yourself toward diplomatic interpretation as a diplomatic interpreter. What are some of the? I mean, that is an unusual profession. I mean, in terms of the sheer skills. I think I mentioned to you that when I was reading your book, I looked at the pictures of you. There were many photographs of you in a setting with various leaders, and the leaders were generally talking.
Hmm.
And I noticed in every picture that you were just staring intently at the leaders. And of course, it finally dawned on me, well, yes, he has to stare because he's concentrating So, I mean, the skills it takes to be an interpreter must be quite unique. You have to, A, be able to concentrate. Is that true? I mean, just, I
Yeah,
mean, were you not
concentration,
exhausted?
concentration is enormously important. You really have to unplug yourself from anything extraneous, whether any thoughts that you might have when you are interpreting, whether it is the emotional impact or your emotional attitude toward what is being said. You have to really cut this off, absolutely. Actually, the profession of interpreter has two aspects. One is simultaneous interpretation, when you
Right.
interpret using the equipment, the headphones, and the mic simultaneously with the speaker. And that is what you do at the United Nations. And consecutive interpretation, which is you listen, sometimes you take notes, and then whether it is just one sentence or whether it could be like 1 or 2 or 3 minutes that the speaker is saying something, you have to take notes, remember what he or she has said, and then give the interpretation either in a foreign language or into your native language. So those
Which
are
which do you prefer?
in diplomatic practice, it's normally you interpret your guy, so you interpret into English or French from your native language. The idea is that you do understand what your guy is saying better than you understand a foreign language. It's not always so, it's not exactly so, but that is also because you are better prepared. You are better prepared to interpret, in my case, the Soviet or the Russian representative because you know the negotiating position of your country a lot better than you know what to expect
So you do have to
from
learn. You
the
do have to
counterpart.
study the positions and
Oh,
know
absolutely,
concepts. And do
absolutely.
you think that is the consecutive? Do you prefer simultaneous versus consecutive?
Sometimes, but actually they're using simultaneous interpretation more and more in diplomatic practice today, and I think that's okay. But sometimes, there are one-on-one negotiations where just the two presidents are present, and that, of course, is where you cannot use any equipment, and that is where you're with them, and sometimes you are the only person. In most cases, of course, there is also the interpreter of the other side. Simultaneous interpretation is where you mostly interpret into your language, your
word for
native
word, yeah.
language. Native language, it's word for word, not always so, but anyway, you work in the interpretation booth, and at the United Nations. I remember interpreting people like Henry Kissinger, Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, Archbishop Makarios of Cyprus, some very, let's put it this way, bad individuals like the Ugandan dictator Idi Amin, all kinds of people. And of course, what you think about what they're saying, you absolutely have to cut off.
Yeah.
You are just doing your work as best you can. And of course, there are more, I would say, unexpected things in simultaneous interpretation
how many
than in
languages?
consecutive.
How many languages?
My
do
working
you speak?
languages in simultaneous interpretation are English and French. In diplomatic interpretation, it's English because I later was working at the USA desk of the Soviet Foreign Ministry. So in the Foreign Ministry, basically you concentrate on one language, and so for me it was English.
So you speak French.
I speak French.
You speak Russian, obviously.
Yeah,
What else?
it is an asset, but the funny thing is, I happen to speak French rather well. So the French, when they listen to me speaking, asking a question, they immediately begin to answer, although I were French, and they speak very fast, and I sometimes do not fully understand them. So I tell them, please, not so fast.
Well, so what do you,
Actually, I noticed here in Arkansas that I sometimes ask people not to speak very fast.
yes, and we also use, as I mentioned to you the other night, we use all these little idioms in the South,
Yeah,
especially.
sure.
Like, I was telling Pavel, I said, when I see somebody that looks terrible, I'll say, well, she looks like 9 miles of gravel road. I mean,
Okay. Well,
how are you gonna translate
I,
that
I,
to
I
what
guess I guess I will understand from the context and
I don't think
from
she
your
looks good.
intonation
Yes.
what you meant, even if I have never heard
And what
that
about what
particular
about
phrase, that
profanity?
particular impression.
What
Excuse me?
about profanity? I mean, I'm surely you've interpreted
Prof-
people who use foul language. Do you?
yeah. Well, profanity is an interesting dilemma for an interpreter because profanity is different in different languages. There are different levels of profanity in different languages. But frankly, I do not use profanity very often when I interpret into Russian, even if a phrase in English or French is quite rude. I don't use profanity because, frankly, Russian profanity is a lot more profane than in practically any other language.
You need to teach me a few of those words. I need to. I
That
need to
that's
know
what
how to
that's what
swear
many
without
people
anybody
want to
knowing how to
know. For some
swear.
reason, many people who are learning Russian want to start with obscenities and profanities.
So you moved
Anyway,
on to, and I will say before we get too far into the world, as we think about the Cold War, because I want to move into some of your diplomatic work that you did. Obviously, your work with Gorbachev. I mean, you've interpreted for Shevardnadze. You've done some really high-powered work all the way through, and the audience is going to mostly be familiar with Gorbachev, obviously. But you and I talked about the fact that we grew up, we were sort of Cold War babies. You and I, we both really were born at the beginning of the Cold War. We have lived through the entirety of the Cold War, and I can't help but draw a slight, but wonder what you thought compared to what I thought when I was growing up. I think um, my impression of Russia at the time, well, for one thing, in school, we were shown these videos of people melting, all the things that would happen in a nuclear attack. People are melting, they tell you, get under your desk. We have these little drills. Many people in the room will remember them. And I said to you, when I was about 10 years old, I'd watched one of those videos. They sent us under our desk. I was tired of doing all that. I went home and told my father, I said, Daddy, how long is it going to keep me from melting to go under my desk? And he said, oh, about 10 seconds. And I said, well, and then my mother, that of course precipitated a horrible argument between my parents because my mother thought you shouldn't upset your daughter like this, tell her something else. In Russia, you said you didn't have those exercises.
yeah, there would be sometimes maybe a talk or a lecture about civil defense and about the various impacts of nuclear weapons, including blast, including radiation, including fallout, etc. But I don't recall, exercises in ducking under your desk or something like this, maybe because our desks were somewhat different from yours. But mostly, I would say the reason was that the Soviet government didn't like to disturb people. Even information about air crashes was, uh, not widely distributed in the Soviet Union, certainly not on kind of a national television, because they didn't want people to be upset about these things. And they thought that, well, people might, stop flying, something like this. So there was a certain kind of fatherly or motherly attitude of the Soviet government toward
Sort of
people.
protecting you from
Oh,
that stuff.
right. And so even though certainly, the idea of civil defense, the idea that the government is trying to take care of you, that it has air defense, this kind of thing, uh, that was made known to the people. But basically, the Soviet propaganda very often tended to at least attempt a kind of
calming effect rather than an effect that could upset people. So it was a little different, I would say, for maybe cultural or political reasons. But yes, indeed, I grew up as a kid who was afraid of nuclear war. At the same time, I do remember that every Soviet leader after Stalin certainly wanted to have normal and perhaps even friendly relations with the United States. Nikita Khrushchev came to this country, if I'm not mistaken, in 1959, and he met with President Eisenhower. They had good talks, I think. He also went to Iowa and he befriended an American agricultural leader by the name of Roswell Garst. He saw corn, huge plantations of corn. And so when he came back, he said, we in the Soviet Union also need to grow corn because it's very productive, it's good feed, etc., etc. And it's interesting, when he returned from that first trip to the United States, there was a kind of welcome rally for him at one of the biggest sports arenas in the country, probably the biggest sports arena, called the Palace of Sports. And so thousands of people, I think their capacity was like 16,000 persons, came, and carefully selected people, of course, activists, etc., etc. And they gave him such a warm welcome. Khrushchev was actually beginning to lose popularity. But for this welcome meeting or rally or whatever, for this welcome meeting, people came with their eyes kind of full of hope because Khrushchev proclaimed, well, we have differences with the United States, but I believe that we can become friends and partners and we can cooperate. And people, applauded. They gave him a standing ovation, this kind of thing. People wanted, a good relationship with the United States. And so Khrushchev proclaimed the so-called the principle of peaceful coexistence. Well, we're different, but we can peacefully coexist and even cooperate. But then, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. And that is one of the worst experiences of my lifetime, because even though they did not give full information about what was happening, we all understood. I was 13 years old at that time, but we all understood that our two nations were on the verge of nuclear war. And it was a terrible experience. I remember as today the moment when they read on television Khrushchev's letter to Kennedy, actually proclaiming that we agree to withdraw
So this was
our
read on
forces.
Russian television.
It was on Russian television. And it was a very carefully crafted letter. I actually worked with some people who participated in drafting that letter to Kennedy. It was very carefully crafted, I would say, so as not to make the retreat seem humiliating, but at the same time not to announce that the US was also withdrawing missiles from Turkey, because Kennedy insisted that that would not be announced. So it was a kind of diplomatic dance, but I remember that, again, all of us, and even I, a 12, 13-year-old kid, understood that that was the end of this particular crisis. And I think that both Kennedy and Khrushchev were so scared by what had happened that they decided that we need to make another attempt to put relations on track, to prevent nuclear war. And Kennedy made a speech at the American University in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And that was a speech where she said, yes, we have differences with the Soviet Union. I think she used the word abhor communism, but the Soviets are people like us. We need to make peace with them. We need world peace. And this peace should not be a Pax Americana. This should not be a peace for America only and kind of led by America, controlled by America. Either, he said, it is peace for all, or there would be no peace at all. And that was a totally different
Powerful.
concept and very similar, actually, to the concept of peaceful coexistence.
Ultimately.
So then, of course, Kennedy was assassinated, Khrushchev was ousted. I wouldn't say that their successors wanted a war or wanted a confrontation, but a few years were, I think, years of mistrust, misunderstanding, and it was only later when Nixon and Kissinger and Brezhnev started negotiations on arms control, initially very unsuccessful, that there was hope that relations would improve and that the leaders would set the relations on course and keep them on that course.
What did you think of Brezhnev?
Brezhnev was, in a sense, a tragic figure. He definitely understood the need for good relations with the US. He sometimes took decisions on arms control and generally on military matters that the Soviet conservatives and the Soviet military old guard did not like. His own Minister of Defense did not particularly like the first agreements on arms control that Brezhnev and Nixon concluded. So in that sense, I think he was a positive figure.
And what were you doing at that time? Where were you working?
I
What
was still
your-
a student at that
Okay.
linguistic university. And so Brezhnev, and generally I think he was a good man, but I think Brezhnev is the person who is primarily responsible for economics stagnation and for emphasizing, I would say, guns rather than butter. So the Soviet economy became heavily militarized under Brezhnev. I think he mishandled some of the relationship with the Western countries, and I think he made a big mistake by putting Soviet troops into Afghanistan. That is what, frankly, crushed the relationship between our two countries. And also, of course, some of the deployments of Soviet missiles, such as the missile that was called the SS-20, that too, looking back on it, was probably a mistake. So, like probably all political leaders, Brezhnev was a complicated figure, but generally not a bad man. No.
So we moved forward. Andropov, there were a number of other leaders, and we eventually moved toward Gorbachev.
Yeah.
How did you come to you came to know Gorbachev? Was it through your relationship with Shevardnadze? Is that or how did
No,
you?
no.
was it-
Actually, in '85, when Andrei Gromyko was still foreign minister, I was asked to interpret a meeting, Gorbachev's meeting with a journalist from India. He came to Moscow because at that time we were preparing a visit of Rajiv Gandhi, at that time India's prime minister, to Moscow. And so Gorbachev granted an interview to that reporter, and I was asked to interpret it. And apparently, Gorbachev's associates who were present liked my interpretation.
Uh-huh.
And then I did the interpretation during the visit itself, the visit of Rajiv Gandhi itself. They had quite deep conversations, I must say. That was the first time when I was actually interpreting a conversation at the highest level, and they did not just read their talking points. They actually did not read any talking points. They had a free-flowing discussion, and it's not easy, and there was no interpreter on the Indian side, so I was alone. It was a challenge, I would say, on the one hand, but on the other hand, I was kind of quite confident that I would do well. And frankly, that's probably the most important thing for any interpreter at a high level, to be confident. Not to be arrogant, but to be confident
Be
that
sure you can do it.
that you will up to this task. Yes.
So, what was your very first impression of Mikhail Gorbachev?
Well, she was different, certainly, from his predecessors. His predecessors were Leonid Brezhnev, who died, if I'm not mistaken, in November '82. Then Yuri Andropov, who was the Soviet leader for just a little more than a year,
Also very
and
sick.
then and he came in
Sick.
a sick person, and then Konstantin Chernenko,
Yeah.
and they died in succession. President Reagan said that, well, I wanted to establish a good relationship with the Soviet leaders, but they kept dying on me.
Well, when they come into office sick, it's not
Yeah,
gonna get
right.
better.
Well, anyway, it was not Reagan alone who joked about this. In Russia, in the Soviet Union, in Moscow, people were saying that we're having a kind of funeral race. So, but it was sad because during those 3 or 4 years, the country was going nowhere. The GDP was static, and actually, I think there was negative GDP. And it was a sad time. And then Gorbachev comes in. What was my first impression? Just the same impression that I think all Soviet people had at that time, that this is a different kind of person, that this is a different kind of leader, that he will try to change things. And he did. He did
Yeah.
try to change
I mean-
things, although I would say that perestroika had kind of two phases. The first phase, when Gorbachev still believed in the system and he wanted to improve the system. And then the second period, starting around '87, when he really understood that the system needed to be
Had to
replaced. Not that he had a plan, a concept of a change, every step of the way, etc., etc. No, but he certainly understood that just cosmetic changes in the system would not work.
We're not going to work.
Yeah,
that.
but even when he still believed in the system, it was still clear that this is a different man who will make an honest effort
I mean,
to normalize the country, to change the country.
I mean, he had to be, as I mentioned to you earlier, he had to be a literally amazing man. I mean,
Well, he certainly
to
was
walk
in
in,
many respects.
and
Yes.
yet he was a product of the Russian system.
Yeah.
As we were talking, he didn't come out of the blue as a suddenly somebody with all these new ideas. He had come through that system and still introduced those ideas. He must have been literally fascinating to work with and to know.
Oh, absolutely. And maybe because I was working with him rather closely, I understood more than many of my friends and even colleagues the complexity of the challenge that he was
And
facing.
did the Russian people accept him? What kind of backlash did he face with these kinds of?
He faced the backlash later, but I would say that the initial reaction of the Russian people was that, well, this is a new man, and we expect that he will change things and life will improve. That's it. They did not expect that this would be a difficult and complicated process, and that such transitions, such major and radical
Would be so
changes come at a price.
yeah.
And the price is that many of the things that people were used to would have to change. There was that joke in the Soviet Union. We are pretending that we are working, and you are pretending that you are paying us. And for quite a few people, this was a comfortable situation because, you know, now that older people look at it, many of them are saying it wasn't that bad. Why did Gorbachev start the whole thing?
He was despite the fact that he had this brilliantly open mind, apparently, about changes, he was still, I assume, a tough politician. He could handle he
Yeah, well,
could
he
move
was a
through.
tough politician, and he had to get rid of some of the old guard.
Yeah.
But in this, he actually did have the support of the people because people were tired of that old guard. They don't believe in that old guard. But then, when he actually began to dismantle the old system, such as a totally centralized and militarized economy, no free elections, no free press, all of that, when he began to do it, and the resistance from the economic bureaucracy, the party bureaucracy began, that's where I think the real difficulties started in the economy, and I think he initially underestimated those difficulties. And then there were strikes, particularly in the coal mining industry. Then the republics, initially the Baltic republics, began to show their desire for independence, initially in a rather modest way, and then in a more aggressive way. All of those things were unexpected, and I would say that probably initially Gorbachev underestimated those challenges. But what is more important and more unfortunate was that he did not get sufficient support from the people, and particularly from the Russian intelligentsia, from the Russian intellectuals who wanted who thought that there might be a better way for more radical change. They thought that it would be less painful. They thought that, well, there is another person, another guy who is more decisive, who is more aggressive. And so rather quickly they changed their support to Boris Yeltsin rather than Mikhail Gorbachev. Yeltsin was certainly more radical. He believed that change could be achieved quickly and rather painlessly. And so the differences between Gorbachev and Yeltsin became sharper. And as I say, it so happened that the people, and you can never blame the people, they wanted a faster and more radical change.
Well, let's get to the heart of the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
Let's start with looking at the summits. So Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan began to meet or to talk, and I guess the Geneva summit
Yeah,
was
November
number one, right?
1985.
And so, was that the first time you met Ronald Reagan face to face?
Yes.
And what was
Yes,
your
there
what was
was
your initial
there was
impression?
another American leader, American politician and diplomat whom I would like to mention before I saw Ronald Reagan. I saw George
George
Shultz,
Shultz,
and
yeah.
he was an amazing individual who played, I think, one of the more important roles in ending the Cold War. So I want to recognize him. He really,
You liked him.
and I like him a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also suspect that he liked me.
Probably so. I would
Maybe.
think so.
Yeah, she wrote
Yeah, I
she
liked
wrote a very good blurb for my book.
Well,
Yeah.
well, he must
So-
have liked you. That's good.
Yeah. Why
What
not
about
plug
Reagan?
why
What was
why
your-
not plug my book?
What was your
you know?
very first impression of Ronald Reagan?
Ronald
kind of
Reagan
putting aside what you knew he was there to do and so on. What was your first? I mean, you must assess people a little
Well,
bit up front.
Ronald Reagan, actually, before I saw him and interpreted for him at the Geneva summit, there was a meeting between him and Shevardnadze in September 1985. That was after Shevardnadze had been appointed the Soviet foreign minister,
right.
and he first met with Schultz in Helsinki in the summer, and then he went to the UN General Assembly in September 85. And after that, after his address at the General Assembly, he went to Washington. And that was when I first saw Ronald Reagan. I think also Bush was there at that meeting, the first President Bush, George Shultz. I think Bob McFarlane, Reagan's national security advisor. And it was an interesting meeting. And my first impression of Reagan was that he was the kind of person who wanted to be liked and appreciated.
Hmm.
He
Interesting.
really wanted people to like him, including his counterparts, presidents of other countries, foreign ministers. It was actually a very warm meeting.
Hmm.
Although he did say some things extremely critical of Soviet foreign policy,
Hmm.
he nevertheless, Shevardnadze decided not to challenge him on that, which was a good idea, I think. And when the conversation moved on a cordial track, Reagan was cordial. Reagan
Really
was
was.
friendly, and he wanted Shevardnadze to take a good message back to Moscow. Although, of course, he insisted on all of those positions that the U.S. took, both on arms control, regional conflicts, etc. He didn't budge 1 inch from those positions. But he wanted, I think, Shevardnadze to take back to Moscow a message of potential cooperation.
When let's, I guess, get to Geneva. So Gorbachev and Reagan, what was there a moment when you realized, or perhaps it wasn't at Geneva, but was there a moment when you realized that those two men were going to be able to establish maybe a good relationship? I mean, did you sense, because ultimately they really did have a, wouldn't you say in diplomatic terms, a very strong relationship? I mean, they certainly went through a lot and came through ups and downs in their negotiating.
Yeah, right.
Did you
Of
see
course.
that up front when you, I mean, was it early on that you thought there is something here that might work?
Well, I think at that time I could not really predict how things would go.
Yeah. So
No,
it
I
was
don't
just
think so.
going through the
I would
process.
say that it was later, but I did appreciate the outcome
Uh-huh.
of the meeting, and in particular, the joint statement that Reagan and Gorbachev made, and that has been quoted by every subsequent US president and every subsequent Soviet and Russian leader. And that is that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. That was the statement that they made. They also added to this that both sides will not seek military superiority. I thought that was a very important statement too, and that they would do everything to prevent any conflict between the two nations, whether nuclear or conventional. That was extremely important. So I would say that I certainly could not predict at that time that those two men will practically end the Cold War, but I appreciated the joint statement and also some of the agreements that they made at that summit about, for example, resuming direct flights between Moscow and Washington.
Yeah.
That was important. So yeah, they achieved quite a bit in Geneva, but unfortunately, the arms control and arms reduction talks did not advance very well even after that meeting in Geneva. And that is why in the summer of 96, Gorbachev wrote a letter to Reagan, which I would say, had the honor to translate, where he proposed that they meet someplace, maybe halfway between the Soviet Union and the US. And he said maybe London, maybe Reykjavik, to try and get out of that deadlock that unfortunately emerged during negotiations, despite the very good first meeting in Geneva. And Reagan agreed. And I think that, well, Reykjavik was probably the real turning point in relations.
So there's a highly anticipated Reykjavik wasn't it? It was a
It was
highly
highly
anticipated
anticipated.
summit.
Yeah,
And it did,
actually, it was particularly, I think, after they announced that they would have a second day of talks, not just one day as initially proposed. I think, yes, everyone expected a breakthrough.
So when, in among all of these things, because we know Reykjavik hit a kind of a negative point, where was there a point when you felt deeply disappointed in all of these talks? I mean, did you?
Well, I first was surprised, actually, and it was only afterwards that I was disappointed. I was surprised that Reagan spoke first about the elimination of all strategic ballistic missiles, and then he said, well, why just strategic missiles? So what about all those tactical weapons and nuclear artillery? Let us agree that we will get rid of all nuclear weapons. And that was going far beyond the official U.S. position that the U.S. government had agreed on before Reykjavik. So to me, it was a big surprise. And Gorbachev said, oh, absolutely, let us discuss this. And then the moment of disappointment was that Reagan said, but of course, we still need missile defense. We need missile defense because who knows? There could be a madman who would have nuclear weapons and keep nuclear weapons. We need missile defense. So he said, I propose that we agree that we should allow the testing of missile defense, including missile defense in space. And the Gorbachev obviously could not agree to that. Yeah. He said, Mr. President, you want me to give a green light to that? And well, both were disappointed that they could not, sign anything or perhaps announce anything, maybe not an agreement, but an understanding on nuclear weapons because of that obstacle. Yeah. Missile defense. And so on the way back, Secretary Shultz at the airport announced that unfortunately we had a good discussion, but the meeting ended in failure. And the word failure was the first word that was communicated by the world media to the people of the world. And that was, of course, extremely disappointing. So there was no press conference of President Reagan. He left. And Gorbachev had a press conference scheduled at a big, I think, basketball arena or something like that in Reykjavik. So we got into the cars and drove a little bit to that venue. But then Gorbachev got out of the car and walked for about 5-10 minutes toward the venue of the press conference. And he later remembered that he actually was thinking about that word failure, which was reported to him. And he said, well, I really cannot disappoint all those reporters and people by just repeating that word failure. And so I interpreted his remarks to the press. And actually, one of his first phrases was, I don't think that this was a failure. I think it was actually a breakthrough. The President and I have covered a lot of ground. We both believe that our ultimate goal is to get rid of nuclear weapons. And I believe that we have taken the first steps. We agreed on some issues. We will instruct our delegations to continue the negotiations. Actually, they did agree on a 50% reduction of ballistic nuclear missiles and on zero nuclear weapons, zero nuclear intermediate range weapons in Europe. And so mostly it was, as we later all understood, I too thought that, initially it was a failure. But as we later all understand, it was actually a big step forward. And just a little more than a year after that, the agreement was signed in Washington to eliminate totally all intermediate range missiles, all the missiles in ranges between 500 kilometers and 5,500 kilometers. So a huge segment of nuclear weapons would be eliminated. And it was the beginning of a process that resulted ultimately, after the agreements between President Reagan and Gorbachev, President Bush and Gorbachev, then subsequently Presidents Obama and Medvedev, about 90% of the nuclear weapons that existed at the peak of the arms race, at the peak of the Cold War, had now been
Now
destroyed.
gone. Yes.
And that is an amazing
And
achievement.
a lot of
And
folks-
I do think that we should all be proud of those
Yeah.
achievements. And it began.
Absolutely. And a lot, a lot happened between Reykjavik and that Washington. The sentiment of the Russian people changed somewhat, didn't it?
I think so. I think, but
there
well,
were-
it changed because actually people at that
Wanted.
time wanted cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States. People
what would you-
wanted that,
What would you
They
say?
wanted a new
Do
relationship.
you think it was that desire to get rid of nuclear weapons that was the real bond between, maybe bond might be not the right word, but the real bond between Gorbachev and Reagan?
Right.
Do you think that was really it? I know that I've heard you say before that they both cared about the fear under which their people were living, and that kind of that really prevailed over much of their thinking. So that nuclear,
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it was the. I mean, both of them were. I would use the word angry when they talked about nuclear weapons. It was their resentment. It was their rejection of nuclear weapons that brought them closer. There were still a lot of differences, but I will tell you, this was probably the most important factor. And even though, unfortunately, it was only the INF Treaty that was signed between Gorbachev and Reagan, and they were close, but not ultimately able to sign the Treaty on Strategic Arms, on intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-based ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers. That is what is called strategic arms. Even though they could not sign that, I think that by the time Reagan came to Moscow in 1988, the most difficult issues had been resolved. And there was, by that time, a lot of trust between the two men, a lot of trust. And it was amazing, I was there. I heard that when, after Gorbachev and Reagan took a little walk on Red Square, they then returned to the Kremlin, and a group of reporters were waiting for them near the so-called Tsar cannon, a huge cannon from the 16th century that was exhibited in the Kremlin. So the reporters were standing there, and one of them asked, "Mr. President, do you still believe that the Soviet Union is an evil empire?" And Reagan, without missing a beat, said, "No. No, I don't think so, because the Soviet Union has changed. It is changing under the leadership of President Gorbachev, and I believe that we will be cooperating and working together." And I thought, oh, come on, this is the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
Probably not quite, but certainly a big step, a huge step toward ending the Cold War. And I frankly believe that it was when we were able to work together during the difficult crises. And the first one was, of course, unification of Germany. The second one was the Gulf War and Saddam Hussein's aggression against Kuwait. We basically took similar positions on both of these issues, whereas during the Cold War, it would have been totally different. So to me, those two episodes were the confirmation that the Cold War had ended.
And then along came George H.W. Bush, who was a little
Well,
hesitant.
that
right?
was in the beginning, for me, actually, a difficult experience, because George Bush said that the new administration needed some time for what he called strategic reassessment. And that, to me, frankly, and probably also to Gorbachev, was a disappointment, because we could have hit the ground running and move fast toward the START treaty. It didn't happen. But then in May 1989, Secretary Baker came to Moscow, and those negotiations were quite successful. I think that after that initial disappointment, Gorbachev and George W. Bush moved very fast toward, I think, really a very cooperative relationship. And
Do
that
you
is
attribute
that is what made it possible
So,
to peacefully manage the unification of Germany, to strongly react to Saddam Hussein's aggression against Kuwait. And I think I'll just repeat that. That was the confirmation that the Cold War had ended. And there was no talk at that time about, well, the US won the Cold War. This is unfortunately what began later. And I think that is not a good idea to proclaim victory in the Cold War. That is something that impressed the Russian establishment. By that time, it was Russia, no longer the Soviet Union. But that is something that impressed the Russian establishment very badly, and they thought, well, why make such humiliating statement? Why proclaim victory? We ended the Cold War together. We negotiated together. We agreed on treaties that were equal in terms of numbers between the Soviet Union and the US, between Russia and the US. So that came later. But certainly when the Cold War actually ended, I think it was regarded as a common victory, as something that both sides should be proud of. I remember actually the advisor of President George W. Bush for national security, Brent Scowcroft, once said to me that the peaceful end of the Cold War was a miracle. And I absolutely agreed with him. When we were sitting on those mountains of nuclear weapons by 1985, the Soviet Union and the US had 60,000 nuclear warheads. 60,000 nuclear warheads, each of them capable of destroying any big city. Amazing, where did they find so many targets for those? Anyway, so we moved from that to a reduction initially 50% and more, the elimination of various tactical missiles, artillery, etc. I mean, I'm sorry I don't have here, I cannot show here the slides that would show how that process, how it resulted in this result, a peak and then like this. So I think that both of our countries should have proclaimed a common victory, maybe made a statement, that it's a common victory that we ended the Cold War, that we stopped the nuclear arms race, etc., etc. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, but
Well,
yes, I do believe that it was a common victory.
in America, we always proclaim victory. So we certainly, I think, felt
Yeah,
it was a
well,
victory.
I mean, it's water under the bridges, but I'm sorry that we didn't do that, at that time, that we didn't make a statement about our really common victory over the Cold War.
So moving on, so that kind of brings us to the end of the Cold War, of course, and is a fascinating account. And I think there's so much more fascinating about what you did and the people you interacted with and what you really must have thought about them. Do you think that, just one little side note, do you think Reagan and Gorbachev, I mean, at the end of the day, they really liked each other as people? I mean, would you say that's safe to assume? Or did
Well,
they just simply,
after
simply
Gorbachev
transactional?
after Gorbachev stepped down in December 1991, Reagan invited him to come to the United States whenever he could, whenever he wanted. And it happened in May '92. And they spent some time, I think, maybe a couple of days or just one day.
Did you come on that trip?
Yeah, of course, I was there. And they spent some time at Reagan's ranch near Los Angeles. And it was
Did
a
you ride
very
horses?
warm and cordial meeting.
Did you have to
Very
ride
warm, very
horses and
cordial.
things?
Excuse me?
Did you have to ride horses and everything? Did you?
No,
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 okay.
but President Reagan gave Gorbachev a tour in his golf cart. Fortunately, there was also a security guy there.
Yes, I'm
Yeah,
sure.
but anyway, it was a good ride. Yeah. Anyway, I think it was not just in '92, but even earlier when Gorbachev came to the United States in 1991. George W. Bush was president, but among other cities, Gorbachev visited San Francisco. And so Reagan and Nancy came to the Soviet consulate in San Francisco, and they had a very good, a very cordial meeting in San Francisco at the Soviet consulate. I enjoyed it very much. I enjoyed,
How did you like
interpreting.
Nancy?
What can I say? I was not interpreter between Nancy and Raisa, but I do know, and I think we all know, that initially the relationship was not very warm. But I think they learned, they learned. I think there were missteps on both sides, but they learned. And when Gorbachev came to Washington in '97, the interpreter who worked with Nancy and Raisa told me that they really hit it off very well. So, but in '91, when Reagan came to San Francisco to meet with Gorbachev, again, there was a separate meeting, a separate conversation between Nancy and Raisa, and I interpreted the conversation between Reagan and Gorbachev. They spent about 45, 50 minutes together. It was a very good conversation. I must say, Reagan was very well informed. He asked some very good questions, and I think he received very frank replies. And so I am very happy that that meeting happened, because it was perhaps because of this that Reagan also wanted to see Gorbachev when he came to the United States after he had stepped down. And they had a really good meeting there.
That's great.
Yeah,
So
at Reagan's ranch. I think you can find some wonderful photos, both at on the website of the Gorbachev Foundation in Moscow, but also on the website of the Reagan Library. I really recommend that, because you have there, for example, and that's really amazing, a historic document, the video of Gorbachev and Reagan walking on Red Square, and then going back into the Kremlin, and that reporter asking that question, do you still regard the Soviet Union as an evil empire?
yeah.
And Reagan asking no, answering no. I mean, that website is fascinating. There's a lot of video material there that shows you the progression of their conversations and of their relationship from Geneva to Moscow and to that really historic moment.
So at the end of the Cold War, as it ended, of course, in the United States, again, as usual, there is a strong sense of bravura, certainly a sense of victory. We were happy. What, on the other hand, in Russia, the USSR began to crumble. How did that play in Russia? How do you think the Russian people really felt about the Cold War having ended? Did they see that as a tremendous advantage, not the leaders, but the people?
Well, I certainly believe that the people of the Soviet Union, ordinary people, appreciated the end of the Cold War. They believed that that was ushering in a new era of cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States. So even during the most difficult years of economic reforms, the early 1990s, I think the overall sense was the same among the people. The U.S. leaders were very popular. including George W. Bush, then President Clinton. And I think that the leaders of our countries, Yeltsin in Russia and Bush and Clinton in the US, were actually sincere in their desire and uh, um, in their desire to continue the relationship, to move forward, to move to the next step, to the next level in the cooperation between our two nations. But, I'm sorry to say that, but it didn't quite work. And I don't want to blame anyone or any one factor for this. But I must say that by about 1996, the relationship soured and the good intentions did not produce good results. Again, it's not my purpose to go deeply into it. This is something that is difficult for me to assess. I was no longer in government. But frankly, I believe that scholars and commentators assign blame in their own way. They blame one factor or another for what happened, for the souring of relations. But frankly, some say it was the failure of Yeltsin's economic reforms, that those economic reforms had been associated in the minds of people with US advisors. um, I don't think so, frankly. I think that one of the factors that I really believe worked badly for the relationship was the enlargement of NATO, the membership in NATO of the former Soviet allies. This, maybe it was inevitable, I don't know. They say, well, it's because those countries wanted to become members. But it could have been managed differently. It could have been managed in a way that would not be so uh, difficult for Russia to accept. I don't know how. I was
Well,
no longer in
changing
government.
leadership
I was
makes
no
a lot of
longer in
difference.
government.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I could have suggested a different way. But that's what diplomacy is for.
Yeah.
Even
Well,
when you do things that may hurt the other country, uh, a country that you think and you actually
you have
declare
to work
that you want
through.
to be friends with, when you do those things that hurt them, maybe you can find a different way.
Yeah.
But again, that's not something that I can easily judge, because by that time I left government service. I thought that it was my duty, actually, to give moral support and emotional support to Gorbachev and to Raisa, for whom that transition was not easy. So I joined the Gorbachev Foundation. I worked with him. I traveled with him to different countries, including the United States. And therefore, I was not in a position to judge what was happening between our two countries. But unfortunately, the kind of cooperation that many of us expected after the end of the Cold War did not materialize.
Well, change of leadership makes a lot of difference too.
It
Continue
could
on both
be,
sides, continually
well,
change. Which brings us kind of to, one of the things we continually try to educate people about with the Cold War Museum that we're developing is that the legacy of the Cold War brought us many lessons that obviously many lessons about how to achieve world peace, what to do. Um, and yet things are really changed. We won't go into a lot of politics here, but let's just consider diplomacy. Um, the type of diplomacy that you used that Reagan and Gorbachev were so successful with. The fact that they ran into very challenging difficulties and yet still went beyond those to find what mattered to them most, where they could compromise. They developed, by your statement, trust, all of those things. How do you see that today in our world, not only between Russia and the United States, but we have lots of other very important players. We have China. We have lots of countries that have been in the forefront recently. Of course, Israel, and you've got the Ukraine situation going on there in Russia. What do you think diplomacy still is the answer today? I mean, do you? And I guess you're probably going to tell me yes.
Yeah.
But
well,
and I mean,
I'll tell you what I'll tell you.
more what troubles me is, do you
Right.
think diplomacy may be the answer, but do you think we are in a state to achieve that type of diplomacy, given the leadership we deal with all across the world? I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, our main diplomats are our leaders.
Yeah.
That's the important thing. They set the tone and they set the pace. They give instructions to their foreign ministers, to their diplomats, and so their role is tremendously important. As I said, every Soviet and American leader, every American Russian leader made an effort to establish normal and possibly cooperative relationships between our two nations. Those are nations that, according to the UN Charter, bear the main responsibility for world peace. So we should always be aware of it. With the museum and with this Cold War Center, I hope that you will establish the right kind of narrative, the right kind of story. And an important part of that story was that the Cold War was, among other things, and very importantly, about preventing war. The Cold War was about seeking a peaceful resolution of the disputes and problems between our countries. The Cold War is just not only the hardware of the Cold War, which I'm sure you will show in the museum, but it was also the software. And the software was very often kind of mutually contradictory, but it included, I think, the desire by both sides to avoid the escalation of the Cold War into a hot war. And a lot of effort was made by diplomats, but also by the leaders who are our main diplomats to avoid war, particularly after the Cuban Missile Crisis and later. Both, I would say, technical measures to make sure that the war does not start accidentally, but also the effort to establish communication, the effort to resolve conflicts peacefully, sometimes successful, sometimes unsuccessful. So the Cold War was surprisingly not only about competition and confrontation, it was also about cooperation. And I think that's a very, very important lesson. And that's a lesson not just for our two nations. In a way, it's a lesson for the world. And I think, again, that we should be proud that we established that lesson. Hopefully, we will not forget that lesson, that we avoided a disaster. We avoided a catastrophe. And that can be done even when we disagree. And I suspect that we will continue to disagree on some issues. But, there is always a way out of the most difficult issues and conflicts and disputes. This can be done. We should keep on track. We should keep our eyes on the goal, on the road, rather than be distracted by all kinds of obstacles. And we did have many obstacles, many problems, many challenges, many unnecessary, I would say, conflicts. But even in the most difficult situations, a way can be found to resolve those conflicts, to move forward, not to be distracted. I think this is a lesson that is something that is not sufficiently appreciated.
Well,
We tend to become slaves to emotions, to psychological breakdowns, to words and phrases,
rhetoric.
to rhetoric, to words and phrases that are unnecessary, that poison the atmosphere.
So do you see today, and I don't want to dwell on this because I want to get to another little point before we close, but it seems to me that we're in a situation in lots of places in our world where it is all about who's the toughest and trying to make other people afraid to mess with you, basically, because of this might happen. We kind of try to out tough each other all the time. Do you think that that is a pathway toward developing trust? I mean, clearly, good diplomacy depends. I would not that I'm by any stretch an expert, but it depends on an element of trust, right? A willingness to find compromise. Um, do you see our society, both in Russia, in the U.S., in China, do you see that potentially? Do you really see that those elements are valued and seem to be an important part of the thinking of our world leaders right now?
Well, I really cannot speak for the leaders, but so far as the people are concerned, there were recently several polls in Russia that I found quite encouraging, and that is that people actually will support the president if he decides to agree on some kind of a ceasefire. 80% of the people would support that. So I think that in the United States, my impression is that people would take more or less the same position. I think that, you know, I said that our leaders are our main diplomats. And I will also say that they must be leaders, that the people will follow them. The people will follow them very eagerly if they move toward peace. I think so. I believe that, and I believe that, um, well, let me be very frank, perhaps not enough is being done on that basis. That, leaders will get the support of the people when they move forward toward peace.
Well, I want to backtrack now and just get on to a maybe lighter subject. We did a webinar. You were a part of a webinar that we did for the National Cold War Center, which was about Reagan's speech. I'm just backtracking slightly, but I want to get on the subject of rhetoric here. But where Reagan came, of course, and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall," very forcefully, not at all in a tone or a manner that was indicative of the trusting, wonderful relationship they had developed. Mr. Gorbachev, of course, took that beautifully. And I didn't know till that webinar came about. I didn't realize first how carefully orchestrated. Of course, everything is so carefully orchestrated. I guess you're accustomed to going to meetings where they spend 3 days trying to figure out who's going to sit at what chair.
Yeah, right.
But that was very orchestrated. And I didn't realize until that webinar that Reagan was really speaking to his conservative base in the United States. He really did not want to be forceful with Gorbachev, but he was doing it to appease his own political. And I think you and I were talking earlier that was an example of political rhetoric and how it carries. What do you think about that today in our world? Because political rhetoric, as Reagan demonstrated there, is very much for show.
Yeah,
It's
well,
very much
well,
to make an
Gorbachev
impression.
thought so, and so he decided not to make a big deal of it. He decided basically not to start a kind of counter propaganda of some kind. He actually believed that, well, it was not for him to tear down that wall at that time.
Yeah.
East Germany was an independent country. Gorbachev actually said to the leaders of the Warsaw Pact countries that he would not interfere in their affairs. And he also thought that, well, this is rhetoric and that he shouldn't overdo it in his reaction to it. So basically, he allowed this whole thing to more or less vanish from the political discourse in the Soviet Union. As I said, I think journalists, the propaganda people, were told that they shouldn't overreact to it. But when I think back to it, I do believe that when the people of East Germany stated very clearly their desire for unification with the Federal Republic, when they also showed very clearly that they no longer trusted the leaders of the GDR, that they wanted free elections and that they wanted to become part of United Germany on the basis of free elections, he agreed with that. He agreed because he believed that he had given freedom of speech, freedom of assembly to the Soviet people, so why deny that to the people of East Germany? But it was a difficult decision for him. Even in the Soviet leadership, there were people who thought that, yeah, this deserves a tough reaction. Not just Reagan's speech, but actually what I talked about. The rallies, thousands of people in the streets of German cities in East Germany demanding unification. We are one nation, they declared. So when this happened, there were some people in the Soviet leadership who believed that there should be a harsh reaction. But Gorbachev said no, and not just because we had thousands of Soviet troops there. And if they made even a kind of a demonstration of force there, that could, a little spark could ignite a fire there. But he also believed that the German people deserve to make that decision by themselves. But as I said, it was not an easy decision for him politically.
Right.
But he listened to his conscience. He listened to his conscience. And later, he said on many occasions that the heroes of Germany's unification are the people of Russia, because they forgot the old wounds, they forgave the old wounds, and the people of Germany, because they acted peacefully, because they showed that they are ready to become a united, peaceful, democratic nations. So he said it's not Gorbachev or Kohl or whoever who are the heroes of German unification, it's the people of both parts of Germany. And in saying so, I think he just reaffirmed that it took that decision not to intervene, not to interfere, to order the Soviet troops to stay in the barracks based on his conscience, because he had conscience.
So you really stayed with him till the end. You worked with Gorbachev and
Yeah.
were his
Yeah.
friend, his advisor till his death, right?
Yeah, I last talked to him on the phone, I think a couple of weeks before his death. Unfortunately, his final months were very difficult for him. His health deteriorated very rapidly. And yeah, that was a difficult time for me as well.
I'm
I
sure.
would say, yeah.
He was indeed an amazing human being, right?
He definitely was. I was asked today what I can say personally, how I would characterize Gorbachev. And I was asked to make it very personal. And I said, you know what? I'd like to, but someone else said it better. And it was a Russian economist, Stanislav Shatalin, who had his differences with Gorbachev because he wanted a more radical, a faster pace of economic reforms. And he believed that Gorbachev was dragging his feet at certain moments in economic reforms. But when Stalin was asked, how would you characterize Gorbachev? He said, you know what? Gorbachev is a normal human being.
Isn't that an interesting?
And I said, well, that's the best characterization of Gorbachev that I can
Makes all of
imagine.
us feel good because we all think we're normal. So see, that's
Well, you should think so because that's a good goal, you know.
yes,
Yeah.
that is. So, just to get on to the other really important questions, like you never had. I think I asked you this earlier, but did you have moments? I mean, you have had a fascinating career, whether you think so or not. I think everyone in the room would agree. You've had a fascinating career. You've sat in the making of history, and I'm sure you downplay the role you played, but I know your role was significant. And did you have those moments along the way where you wanted to channel your parents or pinch yourself on the leg and say, "Look at me, I'm actually here. Look what I'm doing." Did you have those kinds of moments ever? Did you ever feel that way in these high-level summits when you knew that world decisions were being made through your interpretation?
Well, very frankly, I think I said that, when such thoughts kind of happen to you, they're totally extraneous to what you're doing. You are focusing on doing your best as interpreter, and that's it. And all the
personal thoughts.
all extraneous thoughts, emotional expressions, and perhaps your evaluation of what is happening, all of that should be unplugged, cut off. Totally and absolutely, yeah, right. It is a skill. It's also important. You're also unplugging potential stress that may happen because of the pressure of what is happening.
So your primary motivation was to be just as excellent as you could be.
Yeah, right.
It was just to always be.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
and you concentrate. So did you not walk out of those meetings and be totally exhausted and feel like
sometimes, particularly when those meetings go very long.
I mean, when I have to pay attention
And
for
there
like 2
were
hours, I'm
there were
wiped out.
some meetings. There were some meetings between Gorbachev and Schultz, for example, when Schultz came to Moscow, and also between Shevardnadze and Schultz. We had a spy scandal, which was a terrible one in '96, which could have actually prevented Reykjavik from happening, because Reagan said, unless he said, we believe that we're being treated unfairly, and unless this spy scandal is resolved and the person is released, the U.S. journalist Nicholas Danilov, who was arrested in Moscow, unless he is released, there'll be no meeting in Reykjavik. He didn't say that in so many words, but that was what we understood. And that was an extremely difficult moment. And so Shevardnadze and Schultz held a series of meetings, all in all, I think like 12, 16 hours, day after day, to try to find a way to resolve that deadlock. And they did. They found a way.
Okay, well then let's think about this. In all of your history, who would you say was the most immediately impressive world leader you met aside from Gorbachev?
Well, I would say practically all of them, but they were
that's
all,
not fair.
including
I want
Gorbachev,
you to name
human
one.
beings, and so they had their flaws, they
I mean,
had their
didn't somebody
problems.
just knock you over immediately, cause you to think, "Oh my gosh"? No, they all.
Well, I never said that even about Gorbachev.
Oh, very practical.
Yeah, well, I would say this, in their own way. Gorbachev was impressive. Reagan was impressive. Um, Schultz was impressive. Bush, Baker, he was a very successful Secretary of State. What he did to unite the international community against Saddam Hussein's aggression and the invasion of Kuwait was amazing. So all of them were impressive in their own way. Perhaps, in a way, the most impressive one was Margaret Thatcher.
Ah,
And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. Because by the time Thatcher became the leader of Great Britain, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, was really no longer that important on the international arena. By that time, it was certainly not the kind of power that it was during World War II and sometime after World War II. Despite that, Thatcher managed to become a very important international leader, a very important world leader. What was her most important contribution? It was that she was the first to trust Gorbachev and to say so. So whenever in our relationship between the Soviet Union and the US, there was a hitch or a really bad situation with a lot of mutual unpleasantness and mistrust, Thatcher made a point of calling Ronald Reagan and saying, Ronnie, I understand you, but please trust Gorbachev. Please work with him. Please seek agreements with him. That was a very important role.
It takes a woman, you know. That's what it is.
Maybe, maybe.
I would love to. I would love to ask you who the least impressive was, but they've given me a note telling me we've been here too long. So
I think so too, you know.
I could
I'm a little
talk-
tired of talking, you know.
I could talk to you. I
Yeah.
do want you to know that for me personally, it's a huge honor to have this opportunity to talk to you. And
Well,
I know
thank you.
it's been
Thank
a
you.
great honor for everyone here. And thank you so much for coming from Moscow, by the way.
Thank you.
Uh, Pavel, Pavel is not, he doesn't happen to be in the US doing some other things and therefore said he would come here. He has traveled here for this event. And we really, really, truly appreciate it. You are a
Well, thank
wonderful-
you. Thank you very much. And
Wonderful.
thank you all for listening, for reacting, for laughing at some of my jokes,
And for staying
and
so
for being
long.
such a good company. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm good judges.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
So,
A little bow.
this way? With this?
No, we'll go this way.
Okay. Okay.
Thank
Thanks a lot.
Wait.
Oh.
You have to wait.
Okay.
I didn't know where you were. One more little thing. Oh, all right.
All right. Pavel, it was such a pleasure to act as one of your hosts here in Mississippi County and traveling all the way from Moscow, Russia, and touring our county. We're fascinated with your insight on the ending of the Cold War and your support for the National Cold War Center. What we would like to do is to honor you with Arkansas's highest civilian award and proclaim you an official Arkansas traveler.
Okay. Well, let me take a look. Okay, this is amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for everything.
Thank
that
you
you've
so
done.
much. Well, I really appreciate this. I already know where I would put this, and this will be in my office at the Gorbachev Foundation. And I know that you know, I'll show it to every visitor. You know, first time in Arkansas, and already such recognition. Thank you. Okay,
you.
thank you so much. Okay.
And I'm turning on my mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. Here, let me turn this back off.
I did fail to say that Pavel has a book about his years, his memoir, and it is a very interesting and detailed book and is for sale here in the lobby and at the Blytheville Book Company. I think it'll ultimately be for sale at our gift shop at the museum too. So please, we hope you'll purchase that and read. You will learn a tremendous amount, I can assure you.
Okay.
We missed
Thank you.
that in the
Thank you so
conversation.
much. Yes. Okay.
Thank you.